from an important keynote speaker that we can find in Jameel Jaffer from the Knight First Amendment Institute is here to talk and just to share his experiences on his first year of the job. Here to share with us as well. But all other thing we get to do, this is really an important part of us, is that we get to recognize someone from our community for the work they've done to advance open, accessible, and transparent government. And every year we ask for nominations from the community, and we get such wonderful applications, you know, in terms of going through these. I'm glad I'm not on the selection committee. And not on the selection committee because it's a tough job, and we hear it from everybody. Well, we're not there yet, guys. Let me get back to where we are. And I hear it from the selection committee every year. This is really tough. This is a really tough job, and I know this year was a difficult one for the selection. But we did make a selection, and Michael Giudicessi from Iowa is our recipient this year, and we're going to get to introduce him, give him an award, and also hear some of his experience. If you've read your program, it's a great bio on him in terms of the work that he has done. And to introduce him, I want to bring up from Iowa, Lynn Hicks, who is representing from the Iowa Freedom of Information Coalition, to make the introduction. Lynn, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the selection committee. Again, Randy Evans, who's our executive director at the Iowa Freedom of Information Council, couldn't make it. I'm speaking for him, and he nominated Michael Giudicessi, who's a senior partner in the Des Moines office of Baker Daniels. No one in Iowa and few people in the Midwest have worked harder than Mike has for the cause of First Amendment freedoms and open and accountable government. Over the past 40 years, I don't know of a major court case in Iowa involving First Amendment or public access to the courts or government records and meetings that does not bear his imprint. In some respect, either as lead legal counsel, as an author of an amicus brief, or as a key advisor to one of the parties. For most of these 40 years, Mike has also been the chief legal advisor to the Iowa FOI Council. He has provided us with countless hours of his time answering questions about access to meetings and records in the courts, discussing strategies for challenging the denial of access, and in training several generations of journalists, including myself. Here's one example. When the Little Storm Lake Times was fighting without success for access to records pertaining to a water quality lawsuit against 3 counties, the editor of the Times, Art Cullen, turned to the Iowa FOI Council for help in crafting letters demanding access. Before the council fired off our letters, we turned to Mike to edit and massage the message. Those letters were successful in large part, and the Times got most of the records it wanted, as well as winning the Pulitzer Prize for editorial writing in the process. Throughout the past 4 decades, I don't think Mike has ever submitted the FOI Council with a bill. He is not driven by remuneration. He's driven for a passion for the cause of open and accountable government. It's my pleasure to present Michael Giudicessi.
Thank you all. My sincere appreciation to the coalition, to the judges, to the board, to my friends who nominated me. A couple of things I need to dispel. If I wasn't motivated by income, I would be a journalist. Secondly, I have sent a bill to the FOI Council. I'm never sure that they have fully paid it. But what I have had the privilege of doing for all these many years is something that I've loved doing. I've loved it because of the people that I've got to work with, the people who are my friends and my clients and my colleagues, and the spirit of public advancement that we all get from doing our jobs. And so I look at all of you and I think of what you do in your home states. I think of what we've done in Iowa. I think about the people who nominated me. I'm going to tell you about them in just a second. But all of those folks work so very hard under circumstances where it's not always appreciated. You don't win very often, and even when you do, people don't fully understand why you're doing what you do, and yet you know it's the right thing. And that, I think, is what's most important about what we do, is we live in a democracy, we live in a world that needs information, and we don't depend on just a pat right to know. What we rely on is this concept that it is for the greater good. That information about me that I might like to keep private is information that others need to know. I've always used the example is I don't want anyone knowing what's going on in my house, but I'd certainly like to know what's going on in my neighbor's. And I read not long ago in the Register, there was a story about school being closed. And the school was closed because that morning a body was found outside the school. This was 2 weeks ago. The body was found outside the school, and so they called school off. And what did the article say? The article said the remaining information is being kept public to protect the privacy of the family. And I think I know in my house, I'm the only one who would read something like that and say, that's wrong. That's wrong. That while privacy is an important thing, there are a lot of kids who didn't go to school that day, and a lot of parents who are wondering, was the safety of their child jeopardized by what's going on at the school? And yet the newspaper didn't report it. It's probably because the journalist didn't ask. So we go back to what we all do, and I guess, let me tell you one thing about the people that nominated me. There are 4 journalists who I've known my entire professional career. And I wanted to just mention them because we're getting to a point, we talked about it here at Luncheon, we heard Virginia talk about it. My friends are aging out of the system, and I'm aging out of the system. And we have to look and say, who's going to do it after us? And in a day where there aren't newsroom budgets for open meetings and open records litigation, where there aren't budgets for training journalists to request things, who's going to do it? And I think the answer is all of you are going to do it. And I'm happy that you recognize me. I appreciate it. I thank you very much. And I ask you to keep doing what you're doing.
Here's the actual award for you. Appreciate it.
Well, can I get you on?
Sure. Oh, yes.
Picture, please.
I'm glad it's not opaque.
Thank you.
This is probably a really good time after we've just had our Hall of Fame awardee to recognize 2 members of our board who have gone off this year after, shall I say, decades of service, at least between the 2 of them. Hyde Post from Georgia and Mitch Perlman from Connecticut have served longer than I have, and I've been on the board since 2003. So that ought to tell you about how long they've been on. In fact, Hyde was one of the people who convinced me to organize Maine Freedom of Information Coalition in 2000 when I went to a conference in the late 1990s. So I would ask you all to recognize these 2 board members who have done so much to make the NFOIC what it is today. Back to the more difficult stuff. We're facing unprecedented attacks on open government at all levels. While the president's tweeting his attacks on the media, it's not just at the federal level that we're under siege. Many of you know I'm from Maine, and we like to say, before there was Trump, there was LePage, our governor. You might have heard of him. He's made headlines that have embarrassed the state for the 7 years he's been in office. What's so ironic here is he made open government an issue in his first campaign, and then promptly introduced legislation to weaken the law. He lost. But then, as the new chief executive, he used his powers to slow down the process to get information from weeks to months, in some cases over a year. But it was also another wonderful first for our governor. He required the commission that was studying the future of education in Maine to meet in the governor's mansion in private. Now, it's interesting, we were talking about text messages. We were able to FOIA the text message that went from the Attorney General to the governor's chief legal counsel saying, don't do this, you're violating the law. From the ombudsman's office, don't do this, you're violating the law. And what was most interesting was one of the governor's own chief aides emailing directly to the governor saying, don't do this, you're violating the law. So our governor went down in first time in history where we had a fine levied for the breaking of an open meetings law. So these battles go on at all levels, and our speaker today is one of the leaders in the ongoing battle. Jameel Jaffer is the First Amendment Institute founding director. He previously served as deputy legal director at the ACLU, where he oversaw the organization's work on free speech, privacy, technology, national security, and international human rights. He's argued civil liberties cases in multiple appeals courts, as well as the U.S. Supreme Court, and he's testified before Congress. Graduate of Williams College, Cambridge University, and Harvard Law School, please welcome our keynote speaker, Jameel Jaffer.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to speak. And thanks especially to Mal and to Dan and to the board. I'm excited to be here, not only as a Johnny Cash fan, but also because it gives me the opportunity to meet so many people whose work I admire. I know that many of you work at the state and local levels. That work is really important, and I'm glad you're doing it. Most of my work is at the federal level. I'd like to talk for just a few minutes about transparency in the Trump administration. You'll all remember that President Obama famously promised that his would be the most transparent administration in American history. When he made that promise, the more cynical among us were disappointed that the president had set such a low bar for himself. But despite that low bar, few people today, and certainly very few transparency advocates, think that President Obama kept his promise. President Obama gets credit, as he should, for releasing White House visitor logs, for reversing Attorney General John Ashcroft's presumption against disclosure, for reforming the Justice Department's regulations relating to media subpoenas, for releasing the Justice Department memos on torture. But in the assessment of many transparency advocates, and probably many of you in this room, the Obama administration was more notable for the extraordinary lengths it went to control disclosures and manage public opinion about its decisions and its policies. It withheld key legal memos about national security programs, disclosing them only when courts required it to. It monitored journalists' phone records and served them with subpoenas to force them to reveal their sources. It labeled one reporter a criminal co-conspirator in order to justify a search of his emails. And it prosecuted more whistleblowers and leakers than all previous administrations combined. Margaret Sullivan wrote in the Washington Post that, quote, after early promises to be the most transparent administration in history, the Obama administration turned out to be one of the most secretive. James Goodale, who's former general counsel to the New York Times, said that President Obama's record on press freedom and national security rivaled that of President Nixon. Now, of course, many people who criticized President Obama's record are now feeling a little wistful. President Obama's transparency record was not what we hoped it would be. But unexpectedly, it seems relevant now that President Obama didn't routinely question the value of First Amendment freedoms, demonize the press, or deliberately undermine the public's confidence in it. And yet there's an argument to be made that President Trump is now delivering the transparency that President Obama failed to. On The Daily Show, Politico's editor-in-chief, John Harris, explained the argument in this way. Ordinarily, if you want to know what's going on inside a West Wing, you wait for a couple of years for Bob Woodward to write a book. You wait 10 years for somebody to write their memoirs. But now there's no need to wait. We're getting the inside dope about White House goings-on in real time. Michael Kinsley, in a special New York Times session, inexplicably titled, "Say Something Nice About Donald Trump," wrote this: "Donald Trump is running what might be the most transparent administration in history." Is he? Are we now entering transparency's golden era? Is President Trump delivering what President Obama wouldn't or couldn't? In a word, no. But I'd like to give that argument its due. I'd also like to offer a few reasons why I don't think we should embrace it. Let's begin, though, by acknowledging that we're awash in the kind of information that was almost impossible to come by just a year ago. First, leaks. To say that the Trump administration leaks like a sieve would be ungenerous to citizens. Since President Obama took office, the media has overflowed with stories that couldn't have been written without the cooperation of insiders. Insiders who felt free and perhaps even obliged to disclose information that the administration couldn't possibly have wanted them to disclose. In The Atlantic, Jack Goldsmith writes, quote, "We have never seen anything like the daily barrage of leaks that have poured out of the Trump's executive branch." A few months ago, Republican staff of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security issued a report contending that during the Trump administration's first 126 days, the media had published 125 distinct stories based on leaks of national security information. Some of the leaks concerned what are ordinarily the government's most closely held secrets: the contents of surveillance intercepts, the workings of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the substance of FBI interviews, and the directions and findings of FBI investigations. Several of the stories quoted directly from President Trump's calls with foreign leaders. A more or less random selection of the headlines. From the Washington Post, "Jared Kushner now a focus in Russia investigation." From the New York Times, "Top Russian officials discussed how to influence Trump aides last summer." From CNN, "Comey now believes Trump was trying to influence him." And once again from the Washington Post, "Internal Trump administration data undercuts travel ban." In themselves, of course, leaks of national security information are nothing new. Max Frankel, who was then the Washington bureau chief for the New York Times, famously observed in 1971 that if the media were to stop disclosing putative national security secrets, there could be no adequate diplomatic, military, and political reporting of the kind our people take for granted, either abroad or in Washington. And we all know that news stories based on leaks were a fixture during the Obama administration. But there are leaks and then there are leaks. Many of the leaks during the Obama administration were of a different quality than the ones appearing in the press now. They were calculated revelations by administration loyalists, probably senior officials, meant to bolster the administration's public messaging or to correct what the administration believed to be public misconceptions about its policies. The leak, Henry Cabot Lodge, the ambassador to South Vietnam in 1963, said, is the prerogative of the ambassador. It's one of my weapons for doing this job. Many of the leaks that appeared in the media during the Obama administration were of that character and that pedigree. They reflected deliberate strategic efforts by senior officials to shape public opinion about their decisions and their policies. They were plants rather than leaks, or they were something in between, what Columbia Law School professor David Posen has memorably called pleaks. A few years ago, I litigated a series of FOIA cases about the Obama administration's use of armed drones to carry out targeted killings overseas. The administration argued in court that any disclosure on that topic would compromise national security. Meanwhile, officials fed information to reporters under cover of anonymity. ProPublica collected hundreds of news stories in which statements about the purported effectiveness or lawfulness of the drone program were attributed to unnamed government sources. In this context, officials were disclosing classified information in a concerted effort to influence public opinion. They disclosed information that cast the drone program in a favorable light, and they withheld information that didn't. On the whole, the leaks that we are seeing now in the media are very different. They don't reinforce the Trump administration's messaging, they contradict it. They don't reflect a disciplined effort on the part of the Trump administration to shape press coverage of its policies. To the contrary, they offer narratives that compete with the ones the administration is pushing in its official communications. The executive may be many things right now, but unitary is not one of them. There is no official line, singular. There is a proliferation of official lines, and quasi-official lines too, with the result that we know much more about the White House than we otherwise might. Now, the claim that the Trump administration is especially transparent isn't based solely on the proliferation of leaks. There's also President Trump's Twitter account. I don't need to tell you that the @RealDonaldTrump account is something entirely unprecedented. A spigot of presidential disclosures, a stream of presidential consciousness, what sometimes seems like a direct tap into the president's brain. The president has tweeted 2,100 times since November 9th, an average of 7 times a day. Each tweet has shed light on official decisions or policies, or at least on the temperament, character, and motives of the person most responsible for them. We may not always like what we see, but the fact that we see it is nonetheless nothing short of amazing. We're privy to the president's thought process. We're witnesses to the waxing and waning of his passions, negotiations with foreign leaders, the shivving of political opponents, the flattering of allies, the elevation and humiliation of aides and secretaries. We are CC'd on the kinds of communications that the executive branch usually safeguards most fiercely. The president's first takes, his hot takes, his quick takes, not just presidential communications, but presidential deliberations. And not just presidential deliberations, but deliberations about foreign policy and national security. The kinds of communications that were somebody to request them under the FOIA would be withheld on the basis of more exemptions than you could count. It was through @RealDonaldTrump that we learned that John Kelly would become the president's chief of staff, that the president hadn't taped his phone calls with former FBI director Jim Comey, and more recently that the president had concluded that, quote, only one thing would work against North Korea. The @RealDonaldTrump account gives all of us access that even the most favored White House reporters could never even have dreamed of. From Politico's John Harris, quote, you don't have to wait for Trump to tell you what's on his mind, to tell you who he's angry at, what his vendettas are, who he wants to pay back. All you have to do is wait until 10 to 6 in the morning. Others have analogized President Trump's Twitter account to President Roosevelt's radio addresses, and the analogy is apt in some ways. Between the spring of 1933 and the summer of 1944, President Roosevelt delivered 28 radio addresses on topics ranging from economic conditions in the United States to the rise of fascism in Europe. Like Trump's use of Twitter, FDR's radio addresses were an experiment with a new communications technology. They were an effort by the president to appeal directly to the electorate without the mediation of newspapers controlled by political opponents. FDR used his radio addresses to speak to Americans personally, even intimately, eschewing some of the formalities of his office and addressing listeners as you and my friends. This is why they were called fireside chats. The analogy to FDR's radio addresses, though, goes only so far. FDR's addresses involved the recitation of prepared remarks. They were calculated rather than spontaneous. And without putting too fine a point on it, the tone of those prepared remarks was very different from the tone of President Trump's tweets. President Roosevelt's radio addresses were in large part an effort to bolster public confidence in American institutions and in the viability of the American project during the Great Depression. They were meant to calm fears, not to stoke them. Their overall message was the same one that President Roosevelt had conveyed in his first inaugural address, that the challenges confronting the nation were profound, but that America would revive and prosper, and that the only thing Americans had to fear was fear itself. Perhaps the better analogy isn't to FDR's radio addresses, but to Nixon's tapes. It was actually FDR who introduced the practice of taping conversations in the White House. Nixon was only following tradition. He came to regret having followed it, of course. But I mention the tapes here not because of the role they came to play in the Watergate investigation or in Nixon's resignation from office, but because of their content, which featured Nixon's free association commentary on issues both trivial and momentous. The commentary is raw, intimate, coarse, vengeful, petty, impulsive, and very often self-incriminatory. All adjectives that many would apply to President Trump's Twitter feed. President Nixon's biographer, John Farrell, said recently that historians would pore over President Trump's tweets for the very same reason they pore over President Nixon's tapes, because they expose the, quote, unvarnished presidential id. Now, Nixon made his tapes for his own purposes and not for public disclosure. They were secrets, not 140-character broadcasts. Nixon fired the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General and fought all the way to the Supreme Court in an unsuccessful effort to present their release. But that's exactly why Trump's Twitter account is so extraordinary. The kind of commentary that President Nixon once recorded surreptitiously, President Trump now broadcasts contemporaneously. Trump's tweets are the Nixon tapes, the unvarnished presidential id, but live streamed. They're more than that, too. Where FDR's radio addresses were one-way broadcasts, Trump's Twitter account is interactive. Twitter allows the president to broadcast his messages to the public, but it also allows members of the public to respond to the president and to engage with one another. The responses themselves supply a kind of transparency because they're indicators of public sentiment about the president and his policies. Now, they're imperfect indicators. For the past few months, the Knight Institute has been litigating a First Amendment challenge to the president's practice of blocking people from his Twitter account because of their expressed viewpoints. The essence of our complaint is that the president is turning a public forum into an echo chamber. Still, despite the president's blocking of some critics, the comment threads associated with the president's tweets do tell us something useful about how the public reacts to the president's statements. So, if leaks are proliferating and the president is tweeting, why resist the notion that we're entering transparency's golden age? Why resist the idea that the workings of government, or of the White House at least, are more visible to us now than ever before? Well, let me offer a few reasons. First, while disclosure is generally to be celebrated, it matters what's being disclosed. Some of the disclosures we read in the press are valuable, others are less so. Some of the president's tweets are valuable, but many are not. They're noise at best. Earlier this week, Jack Schaefer wrote in Politico that a great number of the president's tweets are meant not to inform the public, but to reset the news agenda. That's plainly right. These tweets are better conceived of as distractions rather than disclosures. Of course, at some meta level, the revelation that the president is trying to reset the news agenda is itself a disclosure of something interesting and important. But that meta-disclosure comes at a cost. Increasing the noise-to-signal ratio, which is what the president is sometimes doing, means that the conversations we really need to have are more difficult to have. In a paper called Is the First Amendment Obsolete?, Tim Wu, another Columbia Law School professor, observes that the seminal First Amendment cases of the last century were focused on the threat of government censorship. The implicit assumption in those cases was that speakers were scarce and they needed legal protection. But there's no such scarcity today. For anyone with even limited means, it's easy to broadcast a message to millions of people. Speech is cheap, and speakers are abundant. Listener attention, on the other hand, is harder to come by. It used to be difficult to speak, but now it's difficult to be heard. And that's why, as President Wu notes, Professor Wu notes, you'd be happy with that promotion, there's now an entire industry whose business model is the sale and resale of human attention. Zeynep Tufekci has written about that too. She notes that in an age in which information is plentiful and listener attention is correspondingly scarce, the most effective way to censor an inconvenient fact or idea is not to prohibit its disclosure, but to bury it with other information. In this context, disclosure is a form of suppression. An information glut and an information famine can amount to the same thing. We can put that a different way. For those concerned about the dissemination of information and knowledge, the problem of the 20th century was the problem of government-enforced silence. The problem of the 21st century is not silence, but noise. We should be careful not to mistake noise for transparency. Second, there's an important difference between discretionary disclosures and mandatory ones. To the extent President Trump is disclosing information through his Twitter account, the disclosures are purely discretionary, and not unrelatedly, they're selective and incomplete. Selective transparency isn't anything new, of course. I already mentioned the Obama administration's messaging campaign relating to the drone program, which was a triumph of strategic cherry-picked disclosure. Still, if we celebrate disclosures, we shouldn't lose sight of what's still being withheld. It's worth asking whether the tidal wave of leaks and tweets carries with it the information we most need. The White House produced an 8-minute video highlighting the administration's efforts in Puerto Rico. But a few days ago, important statistics about the recovery effort disappeared suddenly from FEMA's webpage, restored only after reporters noted and criticized their disappearance. 2 weeks ago, the administration released the outlines of its proposal to overhaul the tax code, but President Trump has yet to release his own tax returns. And for the past few months, the Knight Institute has been litigating for the release of visitor logs for the White House, Mar-a-Lago, and Trump Tower. The idea being that the public should know who has access to the president. Those records are still being withheld. Third, the abundance of leaks will almost certainly be short-lived. The day after the Washington Post published leaked transcripts of President Trump's phone calls with the Mexican president and the Australian Prime Minister, Attorney General Jeff Sessions condemned what he called the culture of leaking and threatened to prosecute those who leak classified information and to subpoena reporters who published it. He also said that the Justice Department had more than tripled the number of active leak investigations. Now, it's too early to say where all of that will lead, but it's worth remembering that the 1917 Espionage Act was drafted very broadly, and that an administration committed to cracking down on leakers or reporters wouldn't encounter a great deal of resistance from the text of the statute. Finally, President Trump's daily broadsides against the motives and reliability of the press are, among other things, an assault on transparency. We value transparency because we believe that an informed public will be better able to understand and evaluate public policy, advocate for necessary reforms, and hold elected officials accountable for their decisions. But none of that is possible if large segments of the public don't believe that the facts being made public are actually facts. The president's campaign against what he calls fake news undermines the public's faith in the media, makes large segments of the public distrust the media, makes it difficult for us to have conversations across political divides. In February, the president labeled the media the enemy of the American people. Last week, the president wondered, apparently seriously, why the press should be allowed to report what it wants to, and he suggested that NBC should be deprived of its broadcast licenses. These kinds of statements are intended to weaken Americans' confidence in the institutions most responsible for revealing facts about the government. And they'll have the effect over time of delinking revelation from political action, of delinking transparency from accountability. A person has no reason to act on facts she doesn't believe to be true. So, in sum, I don't share others' excitement about the purported golden age of transparency. To the contrary, it seems to me that transparency and the values tied up with it face dangerous new threats. I'd suggest that those celebrating this purported transparency heyday have a too thin notion of transparency. It's crucial to remember that transparency and disclosure are not the same thing, and that transparency's value comes in large part from its connection to other values, like reasoned political discourse and official accountability. And those values, in my view, are under more pressure today than ever before. Thanks for listening, and thanks again for all the work that you guys do.
Time, does anybody have any questions for Jameel?
Jameel, a question from Georgia. I'm curious if you're watching the reality winner case. This is the young woman who is in jail right now, waiting trial for revealing what was described as a government secret.
Yes, absolutely. So it's an Espionage Act case, the first one of this administration. One issue that hasn't been raised squarely in any of the recent Espionage Act cases, but I think is likely to be raised, if not in Reality Winner's case, then in some not very far off other case, is to what extent the First Amendment protects whistleblowers, if at all. Daniel Ellsberg tried to make the argument a long time ago that the First Amendment prohibited the government from convicting and imprisoning somebody for espionage without first giving that person an opportunity to argue that the disclosures that he or she had made were disclosures in the public interest. That case got derailed for complicated reasons, but that remains, I think, a very important question, whether the First Amendment has anything to say about the prosecution of whistleblowers. The media, for understandable but nonetheless parochial reasons, tend to emphasize the distinction between publishing classified information provided by an internal source, a source internal to the government, and providing the information if you are that source internal to the government. And it's easy to understand why the media emphasizes that distinction. And it is obviously a factual distinction, but whether that should make all the difference in the world to the First Amendment, to the application of the First Amendment, I think is not clear to me. It's not clear to me that the media should be entitled to protection and whistleblowers shouldn't. Seems to me that the First Amendment might have something to say about prosecution of whistleblowers too. Yes?
To what extent do you think the national media, in particular the networks, the cable stations, should be looking at their own practices to the extent they're contributing to this? And by that, I think about Les Moonves at CBS bragging about how good Trump was for their ratings, where just the Hollywoodizing, sensationalizing things that we all see are going on, and sort of contributing to that feeling, especially on the right, that about the national media in particular.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that the media should think about it, although what they should do is less clear to me. We have this ambivalence even about our lawsuit relating to President Trump's Twitter account. The lawsuit brings attention to a form of speech that I personally don't think of as especially valuable. A lot of it, in my view, is noise, and while some of it is newsworthy, maybe not all of it is. And by making the argument that the First Amendment should protect individuals' access to the president's Twitter account, are we making the president's Twitter account seem like something it's not? So we have this ambivalence, even with our own litigation, and I feel confident that many reporters and media executives have the same ambivalence about their reporting. I understand the ambivalence, but I'm not entirely sure what to do about it.
Time for one more question.
In your Twitter lawsuit, did you go back to, there seems to be Trump tweet previously for every occasion, it seems like that he's, before he was even president or even running, there was some comments that he made on his Twitter account at some point that was relevant to, or seemed to be relevant to stuff that's going on today. Was he blocking people at that time, or do you have that?
I actually don't know the answer to that, but I don't think that it's, I think the answer would be interesting. I don't think it's legally relevant because, for us, everything turns on whether the person doing the blocking is a public official. If you're a private citizen, then the First Amendment doesn't have anything to say about your blocking other private citizens. You're free to do that. It becomes more complicated if you are a public official and you're using your account for purposes connected to your government post. And so what matters most to us is what started happening after he became, or what happened after he became president. The White House did file a brief last night, actually, in this case, the first brief they've had to file in this case. And I think that the defense they made of, the First Amendment defense they've made of the president's conduct here is half-hearted at best. They put most of their energy into an immunity argument, contending that even if the president is acting unconstitutionally, the court doesn't have the authority to enjoin the president. And that, I think, a lot of people think, maybe for good reason, that this fight about the president's Twitter account is a distraction or is somehow trivial. I don't share that view, although I sort of understand it. But if you accept the government's immunity argument here, that has implications far beyond this particular context. The argument that the courts can't enjoin the president is an argument that would have far-reaching implications and I think intolerable ones. So we'll have to, we'll see how it plays out.
Jameel, I want to thank you very much. Before we go, I just wanted to say something. Jameel, I know, this is an introduction for you to NFOIC and to the state coalitions, and as you pointed out at the beginning, you have a lot of work at the federal level. But we want to be able to, I think I speak for everyone here, that we're supporting the work that you're doing on the constitutional level and wish you the best of luck. But also to keep in mind how, we have many states out here as represented, and they are, like we said, boots on the ground in those states, and a lot of these federal things, they come out of these states as well. And so we look forward to the opportunity to continue to work with you and support what you're doing.